Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. This is our 14th class, so we're going to be looking at Psalm 14. Going ahead, we might not stick to our one psalm per class pattern. We're about to get, in a few weeks, to Psalm 18, which is much longer than any of the psalms we've looked at. It's like 51 verses or something. So
Wow.
that
Wow.
so I'm not sure yet whether we're gonna do that psalm all at once or split it up into smaller parts. I just don't know. I haven't started studying that psalm because I'm not 4 weeks ahead. I'm just 1 week ahead. Um and but this morning we're gonna look at Psalm 14. Psalm 14 is an interesting psalm. So, like some of the other psalms, so far I think there have been three like this. Psalm 14 has no liturgical use in the Hebrew, in the Jewish
Hmm.
liturgical tradition. So, and when I say no use, I mean the psalm isn't used, no verses from the psalm are used, and no paraphrases of the psalm are used. It is just simply ignored by the tradition. Um, Perhaps because of its content, which we're going to get into a little bit, it isn't maybe the most optimistic of psalms. And so we have an opportunity to engage with that. So we'll begin, as we usually do, with reading it out loud. I think it's nice to hear it in its original form in the Hebrew, and to think about any repetitive words or feelings that you get, and then we'll read a few of the translations and jump into our conversation. So, Psalm 14. Lamenatseach LeDavid. Amar naval b'libo ein Elohim. Hishchitu hitivu alila ein oseh tov. Adonai mishamayim hishkif al bnei adam lirot hayish maskil doresh et Elohim. Hakol sar yachdav ne'elachu. Ein oseh tov ein gam echad. Halo yadu kol po'alei aven ochlei ami achlu lechem Adonai lo karau. Sham pachadu pachad ki Elohim bedor tzadik. Atzat ani tavishu ki Adonai machsehu. Mi yitain mitzion Yeshuat Yisrael. Beshuv Adonai shavut amo. Yagel Yaakov yismach Yisrael. All right. So that's our psalm, and
Oh, neat.
let's read it also in some English translations. Let's start with the King James version of the Bible. To the chief musician, a psalm of David. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside, they are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the Lord? There were they that in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous. Ye have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. When the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. Here's another translation, this one from the Koren Tehillim. For the chief musician of David, the senseless man says in his heart, there is no God. All are corrupt. They do abominable acts. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on mankind to see if there are any who act wisely, any who seek God, but they have all gone astray. They are all equally rotten. There is no one who does good, not even one. Will all these evildoers never learn, who devour my people as men eat bread and never call upon the Lord? There they are in terror and in dread, for God is with the righteous generation. You would confound the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, Jacob will rejoice. Israel will be glad. And we'll just read one more from Robert Alter. For the lead player, for David, the scoundrel has said in his heart, there is no God. They corrupt, they make loathsome their acts. There is none who does good. The Lord from the heavens looked down on the sons of humankind to see, is there someone discerning, someone seeking out God? All turn astray, altogether befouled. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Do they not know, all wrongdoers, devourers of my people, devoured them like bread? They did not call the Lord. There did they solely fear, for God is with the righteous band. In your plot against the poor you are shamed, for the Lord is his shelter. Oh, may from Zion come Israel's rescue when the Lord rescues his people's condition. May Jacob exult. May Israel rejoice. All right, so any preliminary reactions, feelings, thoughts?
It must have been a bad day.
Yeah, Linda says it's a bad day. The psalmist
The guy
had
was
a
really
bad day.
discouraged when he wrote that.
Yeah, Murray.
I guess a bad day is one description, but it sounds as if the psalmist here is at the bottom of bottoms.
Yeah.
Completely out of any despair. The view is very narrow and has lost all hope. And there's nothing that could shine a little bit of an uplifting point of view for the future, except possibly at the very last line. And the question is, in what situation does one find oneself to be expressing such depth of despair?
That's a really good question.
Does everybody like Linda and Murray find it as pessimistic? Is there any hope?
Well, there's the hope that if one finds God and one wants to find God, then there is hope, then there is a solution, and that all the evildoers do have, though not necessarily specifically, are told away. You find God, and everybody will do well. And it's all implied that those who do follow God, who do believe, will do well.
Another view of this is that this is a caution to not think you can do this yourself. You don't have essential goodness. Think of it as original sin in the Christian point of view, that you can't do it yourself. It's got to be God. And the last line is, when God does this, these wonderful things will happen. The restoration will occur. But you can't do it yourself. The impious declares it is one way to read it. The other way is, even for the not the impious who are asserting that there is no God, said even so, that people really are inherently wicked. There's a wickedness in people, and they can't get to where God wants to get them by themselves. It has to be God who does this by his grace and mercy. So in
I
a sense,
take issue with that.
positive.
Not very.
I take issue with that. We cannot leave everything to God to do it, because then there is absolutely nothing for us to be functioning except by the will of God. And having the free will and having the rational thought, etc., it is up to the human to do something that will please God. And with the help of God, there are many passages in the Torah that says God will bless you in everything that you do. But what does it mean? You've got to do something. Then you get blessed. Don't wait for me to bless you first.
And what is the work that we are to do? Is it we to do the work or to trust God? I think the work is faith. If you have faith in God, then he can do this. If you don't have faith in God, you aren't going to get it done yourself.
I like the idea of I can't remember how it goes now.
When God.
You have to help yourself. He who helps himself. I can't remember.
Not in the
I'll
Bible.
pop in.
That phrase is in human lore. It's not in the Bible. God
Well,
helps those who
course
help
it's-
themselves.
Well, I do think that that Jewish tradition does raise up and elevate the voices from the Torah that speak toward partnership between human beings and God. That God creates a world that is an unfinished creation, and it's our job to be partners with God in bringing greater justice and more goodness into the world. And I do think that Judaism says you shouldn't wait around for the Messiah to come. You shouldn't wait around for God to do the hard work of bringing more justice into the world. You should be crying out to God. How can you stand around while all of this injustice is going on? And then you should turn to the injustice in the world and be God's partners in fixing it. No, I think Judaism teaches in a lot of ways that the way that God fixes injustice in the world is through human actions, just as the way that injustice comes into the world is often through human actions. Well, both justice and injustice can come into the world through human actions. I mean, I think this psalm says, okay, it is foolish to deny God's existence, because living a life that assumes God's existence is a life, hopefully, that is bent more toward that project, that joint project of repairing the world. If you start out with the assumption there is no God, then you're also maybe thinking there is no goodness, or there is no moral arc of the universe that's bending toward anything in particular. There's just chaos, right? And I get that nihilism, right? It's sort of easy to go down that path when you look at the injustice in the world. And the psalm says, yeah, I understand that point of view, right? I'm going to actually express that point of view extremely powerfully. And some of the translations imagine that verses 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 are in fact sort of God speaking, right? That God looks down and says, Yeah, no one is doing anything that's good, right? God also in some translations of this psalm looks at the world with a degree of despair. But there is a path forward, and the path forward is for human beings and God to work together for that sense of return, for that sense of rescue, and that's where the joy comes at the end.
The two extremes are to be impious and not believe God is there at all. The other extreme is God acts. When God acts, everyone rejoices, the greater Israel, all the people, like as Isaiah says.
Yes.
But to think that
I can't hear you. Can I?
I had noise here too. Once you accept, part of the work is believing God. If you don't believe God and trust in God, your work is going to be empty. So the first thing is to not be the impious fool. Before that is to believe in God. When you believe in God, God will direct your actions and empower them. So it seems a flow from the stupidity is to not believe in God, and the arrogance may be to think you don't need God. I can do this because that's what God told me to do. But the cooperation is first faith in God, and then your actions will be righteous in the sense of heavenly righteous. So I think it's not just, I think a good thing to do would be to do the following actions and set up my mission committee. It really is, what is God telling me to do here? And part of the work, the biggest part is believing God and praying as opposed to physical work. So I think there's just mystery and wisdom in this that's not just pessimism. It's a direction to positivism.
Well, great. So, Larry is saying, when I read this psalm, I don't get as much focus on how pessimistic the world is, right? Maybe Larry's coming from a point where, in fact, Larry agrees that there's no one who's good in the world, right? But the psalm doesn't just say no one is good, right? It's not just an understanding of original sin or of some basic human condition of wickedness or not wickedness. The psalm says, "Eino oseh tov." There is no one who does good, right? No one's actions are good. It's not about their essence. It's not about their their nature. It's about their actions. The world is full of people who do injustice. The world is full of people who act wickedly, right? It's not necessarily right. To me, what is depressing about it is this line, "Ein oseh tov, ein gam echad," right? Not even one good person in the world. Not even one good person in the world. And here's the psalmist, right? David, who clearly thinks of himself as a righteous person. And even David is writing this psalm and saying, there is not even one righteous person in the world, not even me, right? Not right. And we are all wicked, ultimately, right? And I do think, in some ways, this psalm is setting us up for Psalm 15, which we'll get to next week. But certainly there's a connection between them. Yeah. Mishka,
Yes.
what do you make of the fool says there is no God?
What do I make of that? That those who say there is no God are putting themselves sort of putting themselves at risk for falling into those things that one would not do if they believed in God or if they had faith of that God existed.
So a person of true faith should not act with injustice, because that person knows that every human is a reflection of the divine image, and to be cruel to another human being is to be cruel to God. If you really believe in God, then cruelty is an impossibility. So Mishko or anyone else in your life, if you've ever had a moment where you struggled with your faith, or if you felt maybe agnostic about the presence or lack of presence of God, or if you wondered what is God's role in the world, how does it feel to put this language? The fool is the one, the naval is the one who says internally, there is no God. Do you think the psalmist ever felt that sometimes?
Well, I think the psalmist felt it a lot. That when things go wrong, wait a minute, where's God? And clearly, historically, there have been a lot of opportunities for folk to think that. Of course, the most recent horror of the Shoah, many people came out of that absolutely rejecting the idea of God. How could God have let this happen if there is a God? As people generally think about God. You know, too many of us grew up, and for the last 400 years or so, grew up with the image of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, with God being an old man pointing a finger at Adam to create humankind. And I think it's an image that's dominated a lot of people's thinking and going, well, that's God, or that can't be God.
Huh. Do you think that God is pointing at Adam to create him?
Touching him.
Hmm?
Isn't it a finger touching?
It's a finger touching a finger.
They're
So
not,
it's
they're not quite touching. But I guess I always imagined that image as like sort of Heschel's God in search of man. That
Mhm.
that both Adam and God reach out for connection. That human beings seek relationship with the divine, and the divine also seeks relationship with humans.
Mhm.
I mean, I hear what you're saying about the depiction of God. Setting that aside, like
Right.
I
We have to.
I never didn't imagine that God was pointing at Adam like, poof, now you're into existence. I always imagined it as taking place after Adam and God both were existing, and that is an image of longing, an image of not quite touching, an image of striving, of human striving for the divine. In some ways, it's a very powerful image of possibility, right? Human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore have almost as much power to create as God, striving for this kind of mutual relationship. Anyway, I'm just riffing on this Sistine Chapel. But okay, what you're saying is when people say there is no God, most of what they're rejecting is certain depictions of God, and not the existence of God's self, right? And in fact, those depictions are not true depictions. They are just midrashim. They are just one artist's imagination, right? And so it's not actually to say there is no God. Just the God I don't believe in is this man in the sky. But if you described God some other way, maybe that right. But I don't think that's what the psalmist is saying, right? The psalmist is saying, "Ein Elohim, there is no God." That's different from any particular depiction of God. Edith.
Yeah, somebody who's been struggling with this whole thing for a long time, I disagree with you, Rabbi. I think that the question is there a God? And particularly after what happened in the Holocaust, the people were looking and praying, and 6 million went up the chimney or died in other horrible ways. And about my thought, by the way, on the Sistine Chapel has always been that God was giving the spark of life to Adam at that point. And so it was, while the physical manifestation was there, man was not man until God put the spark of life into Adam. But no, I really think that what this is saying is there is no God, and we're not talking old man or whatever. There is no God. There is no supreme being looking after us and helping us.
Yeah, I think that's what the psalm is saying. I mean, I think that's what the psalm is saying. The fool says.
Not just the fool.
I think a lot of us struggle with faith, and the Holocaust has come up a few times. I don't think you have to go to the Holocaust. I think just any unexplainable bad thing that happens to a child who dies, for example. I don't think you have to go to the Holocaust. I don't think you have to go to the worst example to ask the same question of, where is God in this moment? But that is to say, I think this question of struggling with faith in this moment of looking at the world and seeing injustice, I think it's in some ways extremely comforting that there's a psalmist thousands of years ago who is struggling with that same doubt. Psalmist writes this psalm like, the psalmist hasn't experienced the Holocaust, but the psalmist also asks the same question. How can the world be so corrupt? How can people be so blind? How can it be that no one is seeking God? That no one is interested in justice or the goodness?
This just points out, Rabbi, that this was a moment of such despair that to suggest that no one in the universe is seeking God or following God's guidance of doing good deeds, of being compassionate, helping, etc. It's hard to imagine a world so completely devoid of any human being having the grace to follow God's guidance.
Yeah.
Then there's the last phrases in this psalm, though, which they're being only a future tense for future, not the conditionals, is when the Lord restores his people's fortunes, then let Jacob rejoice, then let them be glad. Let us be glad.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about
God will act.
we're going to talk about the joy and the gladness at the end of the psalm, because I think you can't not look at that, right? The psalmist ends this psalm with joy, right? After an extremely pessimistic psalm. So I think that really speaks to what does it mean to have that kind of hope. So let's look at this spiritual meditation before saying Psalm 14 from the Korantilum. The meditation is, our entire society is corrupt. There is not a single good person out there. Spirituality, forget about it. Everyone derides and mocks whatever smacks of religion. This must change. It can't go on this way, right? So this meditation, that you might say this meditation and then say this psalm. Why? Because maybe you need to remind yourself of the importance of spirituality, or in a place of doubt, maybe you need to be able to say to yourself that doubt is the voice of the fool, and you want to be able to yes, I'm feeling that, but I want to put it into somebody else's mouth. Or maybe by praying, by saying this psalm, by reading this poetry, you're reconnecting to that spirituality. You're saying, no, I'm going to recommit. It can't go on this way, so I'm going to commit to it. What Rabbi Richard Levy says, a spiritual person often becomes frustrated when surrounded by people who deny the existence of God, to which the spiritual individual's own experiences so richly testify, right? If you are a person who believes in God and has such a spiritual life, your whole existence testifies to the existence of God. And so frustrating that other people can't just see that. Frustration also emerges from interacting with people who act cruelly to others out of a sense that there will be no consequences for their actions. While we all know many righteous people who say they do not believe in God, the combination of God denial and corrupt, hurtful acts is particularly galling. For wicked people are perpetuating the myth that the world, assumed to be directed by God, is in fact a wicked place. What is needed is a covenantal worldview, where God can find evidence of wise people, and the wise can show the fool the many evidences for God's existence. How did I know God exists? Begin by acting the way you would were you in God's presence. Right? Start by acting with goodness. And that goodness will testify to God's actions in the world. Now, I did want to share a little bit about this psalm in the context of the other psalms we've been reading. So we talked about how Psalm 9 and 10 might have originally been one psalm. One scholarly suggestion for why they were split into two is actually because Psalm 9 is really grouped with the unit of Psalms that are Psalm 3 through 9, which were all about fleeing from Avshalom. And they were all sort of based in a particular historical moments in David's life. All of those Psalms could be read, noting when David might have said them. Psalms 3 through 9. And they all had similar themes. And Psalms 10 through 14 is also a unit of Psalms that really speak to this issue of the existence of evil in the world and the frustration about wicked people. And so in some ways, Psalm 9 and 10 act as a bridge between these two conceptual units of the Psalms. I encourage you to go back and reread Psalms 3 through 9 as one group and Psalms 10 through 14 as one group, because they do interact with each other, not just thematically, but also linguistically. And I brought some of that here. Like when you read Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart, you find in Psalm 10, over and over, it talks about people saying in their heart, right? That is internally. And there was also a reference to that in Psalm 11 and one in Psalm 13. So this like particular language keeps coming back in this unit of Psalms, and the linguistic connections help to tie the unit together, right? Were these Psalms all written together? I don't know, but I do think that the editing of them and the placement of them in our book of Psalms, like, does matter in some sense. Psalms is not, we're reading them sort of one a week, but in some sense, the Psalms are they're supposed to give you an emotional experience in reading them, or they are a book, and they've been put together. And it's not like there were only 150 Psalms, right? We have other Psalms that didn't make it into the book of Psalms. And so the fact that we chose these 150, right? I mean, and some of them just might have been, in the right place at the right time. I'm not saying it's perfectly edited, but I do think that there's something to that connection, right? So Psalm 10 also speaks to this point of Ein Elohim, there is no God. Psalm 14 talks about seeking God, and Psalm 10 describes a person who does not seek God, right? And so this idea of seeking God or not finding God, right? This connects Psalms 10 through 14 in a literary unit. Mark.
Rabbi, who is responsible for collating the Psalms?
Yeah, we don't have the answer to that question, right? I mean, we don't even know when they were collated all together as 150, right? Like we have a good idea, but we don't. It's not a perfect. It's not like we have a date and the book of Psalms was written was finished. What I can say is this: there are some sections of some units, right, of the book of Psalms that are clearly very, very ancient, and they were and the Hebrew of them is older, and the connection of them as a unit is clear, right? So, for example, the last 6 Psalms of the book of Psalms, right, which are like, they all start and end with hallelujah, and which we use in our prayer service every morning, right? Those Psalms clearly are a unit that precedes the book of Psalms, okay? And right, and we talked about Psalm 1 and 2, which may have been one psalm that got divided, but Psalms 1 and 2, those are probably later Psalms. Like, some aspects of that psalm might have been written specifically to be the introduction to the book of Psalms, right? And we talked about that a little bit when we looked at Psalm 1, because Psalm 1, mentions the importance of speaking Torah, words of Torah, and like having that be the opening of the book of Psalms harkens back to, right, similar language at the beginning of the book of Joshua, which is the opening of our section of Tanakh, that is the prophets, and the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the close of the book of the Torah, right? So Jewish Hebrew scriptures are divided into 3 parts: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? And the first Psalm and the first chapters of Joshua and the end of the book of Deuteronomy all have linguistic connections. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think this focus on reciting the Torah, right? I think, right, already they had a sense for how the Tanakh was coming together when those parts were edited and written and compiled in that way, right? So I think Psalm 1 and maybe Psalm 2 are fairly late, but we don't know if there's a person who edited it or if it was a group of people. We don't know, you know, how much, like, did they, you know, did people submit their psalm units and hope that their whole unit got in, but maybe like the people who edited the book of Psalms were like, well, we like 1, 2, 3, and 5 and 6 of this unit, but we don't like 4, so we're just going to leave it out, right? Like, clearly 150 is supposed to be like a round number, right? Like, you might expect that there would have been, you know, 149 or 151. Like, why exactly 150? I don't know the exact answer to that, but I suspect that some of these psalms that feel like they were split apart in part to create this 150 unit. No, and then there's like there's a lot of questions about sort of, you know, are these units of psalms, you know, are there some parts of the psalms where like, I think Psalms 3 through 9 were not written as a unit. I think they were written in different times and places, and what draws them together as a unit is that they can be understood as relating to specific points in David's life. And so after these psalms were written, like, somebody compiled them into a unit, and that unit got put into the book of Psalms. But I don't get the feeling from reading Psalms 3 through 9 that they were originally a conceptual unit. On the other hand, Psalms 10 through 14 have such compelling linguistic connections between them that I do wonder, what were these psalms actually written as a cohesive unit, and then put in, or, you know, or was there some editing that happened to create that sense of unity? I don't know the answer, and as far as I can tell, no one knows the answer for sure. Scholars basically have two approaches on this. But one is okay, this is the book of Psalms that we have, so let's try to understand what its narrative arcs are, as opposed to trying to imagine how it came to be. And the other is, right, could we imagine how it came to be, and would that help to add to our understanding of some of these psalms, right? And so that's the, you know, scholars who worry about whether the psalm was split apart or put together, or is this really one psalm or two psalms, they are trying to say, okay, can we learn something about how this was put together that will give us added meaning? And folks who are like, okay, here's this unit that happens to all be together, let's focus on finding all the literary connections between them and the thematic connections. Isn't it cool that this arc like matters, right? So, and Psalms 15 through, I think, 21, I think it's there's one scholar that I read, right, sees a chiastic structure in the theme of each of those psalms. I don't know, some of that feels a little forced to me, but also it's possible that it was written as a unit and got put into the book of Psalms that way. So it's hard to know. Maybe James, if you had anything to add to that, you have to unmute.
Well, you're right. I mean, we don't know how the Psalms were combined. I can speak. I was really fascinated by Larry's comment earlier. This psalm kind of strikes at the dichotomy that is at the heart of Christianity, and that is, well, the only person who uses this psalm in a hymn that I could find is Martin Luther. He loved this psalm, and for very similar reasons that Larry was talking. And it really comes down to, how do you understand humanity? Are human beings utterly depraved the way Luther thought? Or is there some good in humanity? And I've always thought that the whole idea of utter depravity is kind of a Christian evangelical idea. And in the Shabbat prayer on Friday night, God is pleased with us. Every time I say that, I think, yeah, there is some good in us. And that's a very Jewish idea, it seems to me. And Anglicans, Episcopalians also kind of share that. We've taken that lead from you all. But, there's evil out there. There's no doubt about it. The Psalms, this Psalm pretty much is a Psalm of lament that says, yeah, but sometimes it's really hard to find any good out there at all. There is at the last verse. In that respect, some of the commentators that I've read on this Psalm say it's post-exilic. But we don't know for sure. How can we know?
Yeah, I've been reintroduced to Judaism with the death of my brother this year. I've been saying the Mornah's Kaddish every day myself, which may be wrong to do, but I find it very, very helpful. And what it is in a time of deep mourning, you recognize great sorrow and the rending of the world as you knew it. But at the same time, the entire Mourner's Kaddish is a pain of joy, of hope, of love, of trust in God, and of glorifying the name of God. As every one of these Psalms, almost every one, ends, or if it doesn't end, it begins with the hope and positivity of the existence of God, and he will bring us through all this. And he has a glorious plan that we cannot see, but we trust him. And in the trust of God comes this rock that we stand on. And that to me is the message of the unit of these things. Without looking at the ark, there's an ark within each psalm that brings a sense of peace and joy.
Yeah, I think it is undoubtedly the case that that most of the Psalms, even the most pessimistic Psalms, have some ending of hope or joy. And I think that is ultimately a very Jewish and human thing, which is, yeah, even in our most depressed, desperate kind of moments, there is hope for a possibility of joy. So with that, let's look at the joy. And I want to do a little bit of a deep, well, not so deep, but a linguistic dive into this poetic parallelism. So the verse says, Yagel Yisrael Yismach, Yagel Yaakov Yismach Yisrael. Okay, and of course, this is poetic parallelism, right? Yaakov is Jacob, Yisrael is also Jacob, right? This is the same person, okay? And here, it doesn't mean the person as an individual, it means the Jewish people. But the Jewish people is being called both Jacob, or the house of Jacob, sometimes it's called, and is being called Israel, or the children of Israel, as Jewish people is often called, right? And Yagel means to rejoice, and Yismach means to be glad. And so, right, these are both synonyms for happiness, right? So is this simply biblical parallelism? Is this phrase just a repetition of the same twice? Or can we learn something about joy through a deeper dive into the linguistic choice here? So I wrote up, obviously this is poetic parallelism. Jacob is Israel, and rejoice is the same as glad. Or are they? Is there any difference between rejoicing and being glad? Rav Samson Rafal Hirsch pays particularly close attention to these differences to help us dive into the psalm in greater depth. The Hebrew root for rejoice, yagel, is gil, gimel yud lamed, and you know some people are named Gil. Gil means joy. So Gila is more common. Gila is it means joy. In Israel, you can find people named Gil. There are a handful in the United States, but yeah, it's a more common in Israel. Rav Hirsch links the word Gil with the word kol. Okay, kol, kuf vav lamed, that means sound or voice. And you can hear the linguistic connection between gil and kol. G and k are made in the same part of your mouth, and the often letters that are the gimel and the kuf are letters that can often interchange in some way. Like when you hear it and you're not hearing it quite, or different regional pronunciations. Anyway, so he says that gil and kol are connected words, and gil refers to a loud expression of joy, a boisterous but short-lived emotion, right? Shouting with joy. That's what gil is. And indeed, when you read Psalms and other passages, and the word gil comes up, it seems to be a momentary exclamation of joy. That is an accurate read of what that word means. The Hebrew root for being glad is yismach, which comes from the word sin mem chet, which is like sameach, happiness, gladness. Okay, and he suggests that samach is related to samach, and you can hear between the s sound and the tz sound there that is made in the same part of your mouth, and are very similar sounds. And so he says samach means to blossom, right? So he suggests that what it means to be sameach is to have a joy which is well rooted and blossoms over time. This emotion is barely expressed, but is felt deeply and is long lasting. Rav Hirsch notes that gil precedes simcha in our verse, indicating that the spontaneous, joyous outburst is a transient emotion which is best eventually transformed into a more reflective and more permanent emotion. He notes that this sequence, gil first and then simcha, is typical throughout Psalms. And there were several examples of it, but I just gave you one. See Psalm 31, where it says, Agila ve'esmecha b'chastecha, I will exult and rejoice in your loving kindness. Again, gil comes first, and then sameach. First, the transient exclamation of joy, and that hopefully turns into something more permanent. Now, Rav Hirsch doesn't say, but I do wonder, right? Jacob is Jacob's first name, but not his permanent or long-lasting name. It's a name that changes. But Yisrael is this name that Jacob receives that hopefully stands the test of time, right? And the Jewish people is more called Yisrael than called Jacob. So I wonder if there's a connection also in the transience and permanence between calling Jacob first and then Israel, right? That Jacob, it's not Yagel Yisrael v'Yismach Yaakov. I don't know. Obviously, Hirsch didn't say that, and I think it might be a stretch. But but who knows? There's something really beautiful, I think, in this. Going a little deeper into the Hebrew letters and how these words are connected to other words.
In Yiddish, the geschmack it's such a deep joy of taste and pleasure. And Jacob being transformed, into Israel. It's it seems like post-transformation, pre and post being transformed.
Yeah, Murray.
Along the same line, my first impression was that first Yagel Yaakov, that Jacob, the individual, that personage rejoiced. And then Jacob is transformed into Israel, the patriarch of that follows of the people, an individual upon individual, and that spreads to being the whole people Israel are glad and also become part of the rejoicing.
Nice. I should have said this sooner, but Psalm 14 is also interesting because there's another Psalm 53 that is almost exactly the same. And I think when we get to Psalm 53 someday, we might do a more deep comparison of one to the other. I did put them both here in our source sheet so that you can see there are some very interesting differences, but overall this psalm is in the psalm in the book of Psalms twice. So that is also an interesting phenomenon. Like, and what does it mean for us that Psalms 10 through 14 are a unit, but that Psalm 14 is actually twice? Like, what will it feel like when we get to it in Psalm 53 and it's in a different context next to Psalms 51 and 52 and 54? How does it feel different than it feels right now, where we're reading from Psalm 10 through 14, all of these Psalms that are struggling with this question of evil? But I should have said it earlier because I really liked ending on this note of joy. That is to say, there is a real hope at the end of this psalm that our transient joy will turn into permanent, lasting joy, and an acknowledgement that in order for that to happen, there has to be rootedness, there has to be blossoming, right? That for simcha, for true lasting joy to really come to fruition, to really flower, right? It needs to take time. It needs to be watered. And that needs to be done in a world or in a community of people who are like-minded in seeking justice, like-minded in faith, like-minded in acting in the world, in the actions of the divine, and being in connection with God. Because in a world that is as depressing and evil and corrupt as the world of most of Psalm 14, it is hard to imagine the ability of joy to really remain deeply rooted. And so it's a hope for a world that has the space for that rootedness. Next week, we will look at Psalm 15, which I think follows up on these past four Psalms that were all about wickedness, to say, okay, what does the righteous person look like? Let's get a description of righteousness. Hey, we've got the description of wickedness down. Now let's look and see if we can find a righteous person. So next week, Psalm 15.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Let's go.
Thank you.